Okay, with that, Dan Stillerman, can I ask you to remove everyone off the panel except for Arthur Goldstuck, yourself and myself, please? And time is now 7:03. We'll see all of the panelists back in another few minutes. And I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the South African Jewish Report. This is, in fact, the 25th panel that the South African Jewish Report has put together during the period of lockdown. And we have about 1,300 people who've joined us so far on Zoom. I haven't checked our numbers yet on YouTube, but it's fantastic that you've all joined us on what appears to be a fairly cold Sunday night. Dan Stillerman, you seem to be sitting there in a t-shirt or your thermal underwear. I'm not quite sure which it is.
Yeah, it's a little bit chilly, but it's not as cold as I have felt on other evenings where I've been wrapped up like a snowman. So yeah, I had a hot shower, so I'm a bit hot and flushed. So I've gone for I'm comfy.
So Arthur, you do know we mock Dan Stillerman every show, and we promote him to something. We've made him Archbishop, we've made him Chief Rabbi, we've made him Most Valuable Player. We brought him on as the guy who brings the oranges on in halftime. Would you like to anoint him with a title for thanking him tonight for everything that he does to make sure that tonight actually happens?
Dan Stillerman, I officially anoint you the Deputy President of Zoom bombing in South Africa.
Of Zoom? Oh, that's an honor. That's an honor. I thought I was going to be a bobber or a puppet, but I'll take that. I'll take that. Thank you.
And you're the man who pulls the strings, so you're definitely the puppet master of tonight's show. Thank you for pulling all of our strings tonight. A huge thank you for everything that you do. And Dan, we announced on Thursday night a massive event taking place on Thursday. Arthur, you will know, of course, who Simon Sinek is. Are you a fan?
I'm a fan, but I don't follow him religiously, put it that way.
All I can say is I know you don't go to shul often enough, so you should follow him more than religiously. Simon Sinek is one of the most famous people in the world. He's been watched nearly 500 million times on YouTube, his talks. His talk on millennials was watched 80 million times in the first week alone and has been watched more than 200 million times in total. He's written 5 books, including a book called Leaders Eat Last. Dan, can you potentially put up on your screen just an image of, so Simon Sinek is joining us from Los Angeles on this Thursday, which is the 11th of June. He's joining us at 8 p.m. for 90 minutes. It is going to be a live show only. There will be no recording of the Simon Sinek show. So you're either going to watch it live or you're going to miss it completely. You must please go register. We are sending out all the invitations tomorrow morning, and there are hundreds of thousands of invitations that are actually going out. We're going to have a massive audience for that show. So please, it's excelacademyinc.com/SAJR26. You can go register. It is free of charge. And you know, Simon Sinek, being one of the most sought after speakers in the world, charges $140,000. That's about 2 million rand per talk that he does. And he's doing this for us because we are going to be raising money for Africa Tikkun during the Simon Sinek talk. So a huge thank you to Simon Sinek for doing that for us. A special thank you to Michael Sinek, his uncle in Johannesburg, who's put all of this together for us. Simon, in fact, spent a few years growing up in South Africa, and he has a lot to say about leadership under crisis. He's going to talk about how you pivot your business. He's going to say that these are not unprecedented times. And it is going to be an absolutely fascinating 90 minutes that we're going to spend with him. So if you haven't registered yet, our strong suggestion is that Thursday evening, you really don't want to do anything else other than, in fact, watch Simon Sinek on one of our Zooms. So on behalf of the South African Jewish Report, welcome to all of you. Welcome to all of our panelists. And I'm so happy, Arthur, we spoke about this about a month, 6 weeks ago. You are, in fact, the country's expert in urban legends. How many books have you written on the topic?
I've written 6 books on urban legends, going back more years than I care to remember. But between you and I, 30 years ago, I wrote my first book on urban legends called The Rabbit in the Thorn Tree. Then The Leopard in the Luggage, which is often referred to as the leopard in the suitcase, just as the first book is often referred to as the rabbi in the thorn tree, which is actually what I think got popular in the Jewish community. But the most recent one in urban legends was called The Burglar in the Bin Bag. And it looked specifically at hoaxes and mass hysteria. And it is just so apropos to what we're discussing tonight. The entire book should have been about COVID-19 if it had been written this year.
So Arthur, tell us very briefly, the first topic, The Rabbit in the Thorn Tree. Tell us how you got that title.
That was the story of when Barclays Bank, if you remember that bank from a previous era, became First National Bank in South Africa. And they changed the name and the logo of the bank. And the logo was this thorn tree against the setting sun. And almost instantly, people began seeing shapes in that thorn tree. But the background to that is quite important, because what had just happened is that First National Bank had given a loan to Yusuf Serti, the businessman, to take out a full-page ad in all the South African newspapers calling for the unbanning of the ANC. And because of that, P.W. Botha, also an ancient artifact, in Parliament declared Chris Ball of First National Bank an enemy of the South African people, an FNB, in fact, an enemy of the South African people. So the moment that happened, people began looking for evidence, and they found it in that logo. And in the logo, there was the shape of a map of Africa and also of a rabbit, supposedly. I'd say it was a hare, but had to be splitting hairs. People said there's a rabbit, and that is a symbol of the ANC. But the deep irony of that particular conspiracy theory is that a rabbit is what the police used to call what was then referred to as the comrades, who used to go moving around at night, and the police would go hunting them. And they would talk about it as hunting rabbits, or ons gaan hassies jag. And that then became the association of a rabbit with the ANC, which is doubly bizarre, but it was a natural title for the book. And that book really propelled me into the world of authordom.
Well, Arthur, fantastic that you've put this together. A huge thank you to you and to all the panelists. And in order to kick us off, we've got almost 2 segments before we get onto the panel. And our first segment, I'm so happy to tell everyone, is with South Africa's top political analyst puppet, Chester Missing, and his sidekick, the ventriloquist, the corporate anthropologist, the man who pulls all the strings, Mr. Conrad Koch. So, Conrad Koch, please join us. Chester Missing, please join us. Let's unmute you guys and let's spotlight you onto the stage. Let's just unmute Conrad. You're still on mute. Conrad's on mute still.
Oh, there. Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Howard. Thank you for having me on your show. It's wonderful. You and I have the same haircut, don't we?
Very slick. I did it myself.
Yes, thank you. Me too. Me too. We should put our heads together. It would look like a bum. I love it. Thank you for having me here with the Jewish Report. It's an honor. We have heads that are so shiny. If there's load shedding, we can solar power ourselves. Guys, thank you for having me here. Guys, it is complicated doing comedy on Zoom, isn't it? Because we used to do comedy on Zoomer, and now we do comedy on Zoom. As everyone knows, the only difference between Zoom and Zoomer is Zoom connects you with everyone, but Zoomer just connects you with the Guptas. Boom! I got jokes there. Thank you for laughing, Arthur. Goldstuck. Guys, listen, man, we need to, it is a weird way to entertain. So just use the comment section. Say, hello, Chester Missing. How are you? I can't smile at you, Howard. All that happens when I do is that. I look like Helen Ziller having a poo. So we need to learn how to connect. And it is hard for South Africa right now. And we need to acknowledge that. That's, I think, the important thing. We need to acknowledge that. You know, we live in a country. I've got a talk now that I'm doing. I've got a talk. It's called South Africa, Junk, but with status. Because it's not easy living like this. We're all scared we might die. Some of you are watching not wearing pants. That's nothing. Look at me. I'm not wearing legs. So we need to come together, Howard. We need to come together because everything is happening online. Everything's happening online. We're getting married online. My goodness. That little girl over there is experiencing lockdown underneath the Chinese equivalent of Nando's. It's bananas. Remember Cyril Ramaphosa? There's Arthur hiding there. Cyril Ramaphosa couldn't put on a mask. Then there was this guy who looks like he colonized his own face. Now what's confusing is that the government is making us, there's Arthur, making us exercise by being separate, by making us, they're keeping us separate keeping us separate by making us all go outside at exactly the same time. And if they caught you outside in level 4, if they caught you outside exercising after 9 o'clock, they'd punish you by making you exercise some more. It's very confusing. I mean, even Donald Trump, we found out that he wants us to drink Savlon, does he? We must drink Savlon. The bright side is now, Howard, you know why Donald Trump is orange. He's been drinking it. He's America's second president of color. Yes, Arthur, orange is a color. But what we need to remember, Jewish poor people, is that South Africa, you know, COVID-19 is not being experienced the same by everybody, is it? I mean, this is from the Financial Times. Oh, there's Financial Times. Acute hunger by region. In other words, Africa is going to have a far harder time surviving COVID-19 in many ways, and we need to cater for that. We need to talk about that. Okay, just wait, Chester. What? What are you doing? We're meant to be entertaining these guys, and what do you do? What are you doing? You just, hello everybody, how's it, Howard? I told you to keep it fun and silly. No, dude, go back down. You're embarrassing me. I just said, what are you talking? Well, they know I'm making you talk. And you know, yes, can you see there? Look, Howard, it's like I'm Jacob Zuma and you are a Gupta. Dude, my state has been captured. It's literally an arms deal, Arthur. Don't talk about Howard Feldman's going to be on. Well, you know what it's like. It's like I'm Howard Feldman and you're Media 24. Okay, you need to talk to these guys. Go back down. Do you understand, Howard? It's not easy. I'm talking to you now. We can chat to each other if you like. If you want to.
Okay. Of course I want to. Are you talking to Arthur and myself?
Yes, Arthur and Howard, yes. Both of you. Because you both got sexy haircuts. I love it.
Thank you. So have you been smoking during lockdown?
No, you're not allowed to smoke. All you're allowed to do is Zol, not even Zol. That's how you come up with smoking laws, is by smoking Zol. That's what's confusing. Is that the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association, they went to court with the minister, which is a weird name. Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association is a fancy way of saying we're going to give you cancer. So it's very confusing. And ironically, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma is the Minister of Cooperative Governance, and we all know that title is purely ironic.
Chester, what's your favorite homemade mampur?
My favorite homemade mampur. No, I use the John Steenhuisen formula. That's where you make some yourself and then you blame it on the ANC when it tastes bad. Oh!
So, Chester, tell me, when you watch our cabinet give one of their press conferences, do you think it's really a fancy dress party? You've got Lindiwe Zulu with her little berets and her camouflage. You've got Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma with her weird hairstyles. You've got Dick Tracy, who's the Minister of Police, who seems to be dressed up like a gangster movie. Do you feel like a little left out if you don't dress up when you appear somewhere?
Well, you see, the thing is, Howard, that as I'm a white puppet of the white guy's hand in my backside, I'm basically the JSE. I'd rather not comment on how black people dress, especially as this panel seems to have been invented in Europe. There's a lot of white people, guys. There's a lot of white people. So let's not talk about that. What I like to talk about is whether Cyril Ramaphosa has any choices, with the struggle with his ministers. That's the big concern. Because when he saw, when he won, he won with a very small majority. So it was like winning the lottery, but you got to spend all the money at Joshua Dore. You have the same haircut as Joshua Dore, you and I, Howard, so you understand the joke.
We both have an uncle in the furniture business.
Chester, what about social distancing and face masks? How does it work with your handler there, with Conrad? I'm just
Well, the
worried.
thing is, Arthur, I'm made out of latex. So I'm basically a PPE. I can't get coronavirus. It's very confusing going shopping. Howard, I don't know if you've gone to the Pick and Pay, but you've got to basically learn how to dance just to avoid people who don't understand how social distancing works. And then it takes so long to get into the shops, you can catch COVID-19 and recover by the time you get into Checkers. I mean, this is what was confusing. The government in level 4, they flip-flopped on smoking, and then they banned flip-flops and smoking. I don't understand, Arthur. Who's coming up with this? Someone on Zol, that's who.
So you saw, in fact, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma trying to demonstrate how Zol worked by licking things. Was that a good lesson for you? Did you try?
Oh, yes, I do. But my trouble is, Howard, is Arthur will tell you what this, I don't have lungs, so I can't breathe, so I can't get high. And that is upsetting me, to say the very least. My big concern right now is not so much the tax revenue from that. It's this 500 billion rand payout. I mean, it literally, the moment Cyril Ramaphosa announced the 500 billion rand stimulus package, Jacob Zuma applied to change his name to Ramaphosa.
Chester, are you going to go traveling again? Are you going to fly once the aircraft allow puppets to fly? Because right now they only allow businessmen to fly. I'm not sure if there's a difference between the two.
No, there isn't. What do you call a businessman who is also a puppet? Marcus Jooste. Oh, the cleverness of the satire. It's amazing. Yeah, you know, the flying situations are concerning. SAA, they're going to restart SAA. And that's because the gravy train isn't fast enough. The money's just going to go straight from Treasury all the way to Dudu Mieni's house.
So, Chester, there's a question that's come in from Peter Fan, because anyone who wants to ask us a question can click the Q&A button. And Peter Fan says, so Chester, do you think this is a good time to go back to school?
No, I mean, we've got to ask ourselves about this whole school situation. It really is getting out of hand, Howard. You've got to remember that the government, the Department of Basic Education, can't even organize toilets at a lot of schools in poor areas. They can't even get toilets. So now they're promising they're going to sanitize the toilets that they couldn't organize. I don't understand. That's like Steinhoff giving you advice on how to not be corrupt. I mean, it's bananas what's going on in South Africa. But I mean, we need to come together, because the truth is lockdown and this recession is affecting all of us. But Chester, what? You've run out of time. What do you mean I run out of time? Sorry, guys, you meant to sort of wind up. We were going to go to Australia. We had to cancel all our tours. We had to develop these talks, South Africa junk, but with status. If you go to Australia, Arthur, don't take nuts. They freak out. They do. You can get nuts into Australia if you hide it in heroin. You got any nuts? No, just heroin. Welcome to Australia. My point is, Howard, is we need to come together as South Africans to solve this. We can't be the private sector, the public sector, white people, black people. We need to find a way to, you know, the only 2 white South Africans the world knows. Really? Yeah. Who? Oscar Pistorius and Charlize Theron. No, Oscar was a monster. Yes, Oscar was a monster. Charlize acted in a movie called Monster. And then she won an Oscar. Did you get it, Arthur? She won an Oscar.
That's monstrous.
You ran out of time. What? Because of the virus, we're very worried about Chester getting the virus. What are you doing? So I put him in this bag. No, what the hell, dude? It looks like a freaking condom. It doesn't look like a guy. I already look like a penis. You don't look like a penis. How would you know what this is like? No, don't be going, help. Arthur. Dude, you guys know I don't breathe, hey? You guys have been great. Great to talk to you at the Jewish Report. Thank you so much, Howard. Thanks, Arthur. I love you.
Conrad, before you go, can we ask you a question?
Absolutely.
How do you think the media has been dealing with the issues of lockdown, with the issues of things like Collins Khoza and police brutality? How do you think the media generally has dealt with these issues?
Well, Howard, we need to understand that South Africa lives in media bubbles that speak to the communities to which they sell. So I have another show called How to End Racism by Chester Missing, and I find it's quite hard on a lot of media platforms to get them to really engage with it, because we sell our people what we want to hear. The one big question I get asked, the one change that's happened, is that people ask me, Conrad, can you still crack jokes in this time? You know, you're a satirist. Can you talk about, can you laugh? And I go, why are you asking? He said, well, people go, well, and this is journalists to answer your point, Howard, people go, well, people are dying. And I go, but do you understand that this is South Africa? People have been dying the whole time. There's a story I always remind people of, and I'll remind people of this globally, there was a child called Michael Komape who drowned in poo at his pit toilet at his school in Limpopo in 2014. A school toilet can kill you if you're a poor Black South African. So the idea that people are now dying more, well, it's worse, but people have always been. What's changed is that we're now able to see the status quo in the same way as right now, I look like I'm this professional comedian, but really, I'm in the back room of my house. There's a big mess going on here. The truth about South Africa has now become something we have to face. Because you see, Howard, you can't catch poverty because someone didn't wash their hands, but you can catch COVID-19. So finally, as middle class, whites often, and media consuming types have had to take in a narrative that we hadn't been able to before, hadn't been willing to before, about the Rainbow Nation and the social compact of this country. So I'm hoping the media will do more to make us talk about that conversation, if you know what I mean.
I do indeed. Conrad Koch, thank you so much for joining us. Been a great pleasure to have you and Chester on tonight's panel. Really, really appreciate it. Some very thought-provoking thoughts that you've given us. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Conrad.
Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the panel. Thanks, Arthur.
Fantastic. Arthur, that was really marvelous.
It's hard to think of questions to ask when you're splitting your sides. Laughing, or when you're crying for that matter.
So there seems to be a lot to cry about, but also still a lot to laugh about, and that's absolutely amazing. So in fact, one of the sponsors of tonight's broadcast is in fact iLearn, and for a mere 2,499 Rand a year, you can access every single one of literally hundreds and hundreds of courses on iLearn. Dan, show us a video, please.
Sign up to iLearn and instantly start browsing over 700 online courses designed to empower you with a wealth of knowledge across different fields such as finance, human resources, communication, social skills, and Microsoft Office. Each course is designed in short 10 to 20 minute sprints. This makes learning easy and flexible. And you can access courses via desktop or mobile. Sign up for an annual subscription today and start learning whenever you want from wherever you are. Unlock your potential, unlock your future with iLearn online learning.
And now we're going to be joined on the panel by Richard Poplak. Now, many people will know Richard for all his remarkable writings for the Daily Maverick. But we learned a little earlier that, in fact, Richard, trained as a filmmaker, and he has just, in fact, directed an amazing new documentary. And before we talk to Richard, we're just going to watch, in fact, the promo and the trailer of his new documentary called Influence.
And I've had just about every piece of filth written about me. I just think maybe if I just told the truth for once, told the whole story, maybe I'll be better judged.
The story of Tim Bell is really the story of influence over the last 50 years.
The founder of Bell Pottinger, Tim Bell.
Great Tim Bell, Lord Bell, who was Mrs. Thatcher's favourite ad man, masterminded her 3 election victories.
I didn't really know what I was good at, but I was a good salesman.
Now you moved advertising into a workable weapon. This was the beginning of a very new and burgeoning industry.
They keep on saying he worked for Pinochet. I did not. I never met Pinochet.
But you did meet him.
I did meet him. I met him 10 years earlier in Santiago.
Are we allowed to know all your clients?
You can know all those except, unfortunately, the government.
A $500 million contract in Iraq.
As a journalist, you start thinking, what's happening here? Something's not okay.
What went wrong?
The British public relations company Bell Pottinger stands accused of fomenting racial tensions in post-apartheid South Africa.
This is a perfect environment to influence narratives and play on fear.
I'm going up against one of the biggest PR firms in the world.
And we begin to excavate the rot, the truth.
Foreign leaders and dictators, big corporations, Russian oligarchs. He's the guy behind the scenes can fix it.
Is this how the world works? It's one of the ways the world works. Go anywhere, do anything was very much the bumper sticker.
Richard Poplak, a huge welcome to you. If we could ask you to turn on your camera, please, and to unmute yourself.
Sorry, guys, I'm struggling with work Wi-Fi. Thanks, thank you very much.
Well, welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tell us, what in fact did Bell Pottinger do to South Africa?
Well, they came in towards the end of 2015. Lord Bell and a number of his associates from Bell Pottinger came in and had a meeting with the Guptas. And they effectively took on a £100,000 a month contract that would help effectively, on paper, Oak Bay do their messaging. But as we all suspected, a number of us in the media, there was more going on, and that what Bell Pottinger were actually doing was helping doing messaging for Zuma's faction within the African National Congress as well. It subsequently turned out, you know, all of us are searching for smoking guns. All of a sudden, Branko Brkic at Daily Maverick comes up with this cache of emails, which, you know, became famous as the Gupta leaks. And within the Gupta leaks, we find that there are in fact dozens, hundreds of smoking guns. And that's where we learned that Bell Pottinger have taken on this contract to do messaging for Oak Bay that bleeds in to doing some significant messaging for the African National Congress as well, at least Zuma's faction within it.
And what is the message they actually try and get out to the people?
Effectively, the message was one, like all good propaganda, there's a lot of truth, or there's an enormous amount of truth in what they were saying. And what they were saying is that the South African economy is largely in white hands. Now, we know this to be true. But what was happening there is that they were trying to drive as much racial division as they possibly could, to inflame all of that stuff as best they could, and that way effectively distract from the fact that the Guptas were, you know, creating corruption and corruption networks in this country that were extraordinary and to a degree unprecedented. So effectively what it was a cover campaign. It was a campaign that was considered so risible that for the first time in its history, the PRCA, the Public Relations and Communications Association in London, dispelled or dismissed Bell Pottinger from their ranks. They considered it the worst campaign they'd ever seen. Whether or not that's accurate, I have no idea. But that dismissal in turn led to dozens of their clients leaving the company, and a few months later they went into administration.
Richard, I had the privilege of seeing a preview of the movie a few months ago at the Eaglex in Parkhurst, and I was staggered by the extent of, you could call it truth behind the truth, going back decades in terms of Bell Pottinger's influence on politics across the world. Were you also startled by the extent of the machinations of elections and political environments around the world?
Yeah, I was stunned. I mean, once we started digging into the kind of work they'd done. I mean, first of all, I think one of the revelations in the film, and you know, I hope a few spoilers will go over well here. But effectively, what he did to get his career as a geopolitical fixer going. He started out his career doing the messaging for Margaret Thatcher, but his work as a geopolitical fixer properly began in the late 80s, when he was being squeezed out of the inner circle with Margaret Thatcher. He takes a trip to Santiago, Chile. He carries in his hand a letter in Margaret Thatcher's handwriting, saying, this is Timothy Bell. He is an emissary of mine. Please treat him well. He shows up at the presidential palace, La Monada Palace in Santiago, hands this paper in, and is ushered in directly to see General Pinochet. And that earns him a couple of very, very expensive contracts working for the Chilean far right when the dictatorship comes to an end. So what we're looking at here is how power actually functions. His deep connections to Thatcher led him to have deep geopolitical connections all over the world, and deep business connections as well. So when we talk about the sort of 0%, the 0.1% in conspiratorial terms, we are nudging towards the truth. Wealthy, powerful men do have these very, very tight connections. So yeah, I mean, it was shocking to see how all of this stuff knitted together.
So Richard, in South Africa, this idea of white monopoly capital, was that a Bell Pottinger plan?
Well, the terms white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation do date back a couple of decades. They have existed within the radical lexicon for a while in this country. What they did was look to unearth certain terminology that would be picked up by the Zuma faction within the ANC. And those terms proved to be these sparks that ignited what was already, huge irritation, upset, rage with regard to how the economy functions in this country and how unfair and how unfairly distributed it is. So they were brilliant propagandists to a degree. They understood what would inflame South Africans and get us very, very upset. And they understood how these terms would drive divisions. They weren't interested in constructive conversations, obviously. They were interested in doing for their client what their client asked. And that was to provide the cover so that they could continue to do what they wanted to do and eventually to win the 2017 electoral conference at Nasrec.
So Richard, I want to ask a question because I'm not sure they could have been successful without the active participation of the South African media. Even though, and I want to show you an example why, because if you go back to just before Nasrec and the run up to Nasrec, this idea of white monopoly capital seemed to be the biggest issue in the country. You opened up every single newspaper, you opened up every single electronic media, and it was considered the biggest issue around. Now, at the time, I was in fact working on the Ramaphosa campaign. We were doing all of the polling for the Ramaphosa campaign. We had 6,800 people on a panel that we were polling all the time, and we were asking questions. And I want to share with you something that I haven't shared in public before, but I want to share with you when we asked ANC voters, 6,800, so a huge sample, and we asked them what in fact were the largest issues that they considered most important. You can see unemployment came in at 25.4%, service delivery 12.5%, reducing corruption and crime 10.7%, housing 14.7%. Where does this issue of white monopoly capital come in the actual mind of ANC voters? Comes in at only 1.1%. So my theory is that while Bell Pottinger started the campaign, South African media picked it up, ran with it, and it is in fact the unwitting cooperation of the entire media that allowed it to become the biggest issue, but it never actually resonated with the people of South Africa at all. Because if it had, when you ask people what's the most important factor of who you vote for in the next elections, it wouldn't come in at 1.1%.
Yeah, I think to an extent you're correct. And I think what Bell Pottinger were expert at, I mean, this is what they did, is that they fed messaging through to the media. Again, another spoiler from the film is that Bell explains how he and Rupert Murdoch worked together on Margaret Thatcher's campaigns. Murdoch would say, well, why don't you tell our papers what you want them to say, because we want Margaret to win. And Bell would do that. I mean, he would effectively write editorials. So there was this long association with understanding how the press functioned, understanding how press ownership, which is also very important. You're right to the extent that many editors in this country may have been more terrified by the notion of white monopoly capital becoming an issue than many voters within the ANC. So absolutely, any good propaganda campaign has to understand how the press will act as a reactory force, and sort of it's almost like the nuclear fissile material that blows the bomb up. So that data that you showed, I think, is very, very informative, and it proves how good Bell Pottinger were at feeding information through that they knew would start to grab headlines. Absolutely.
Richard, do we know the whole truth about the Gupta's machinations of South African politics? And are we likely ever to know the full truth?
I think we know a lot. I think what the Gupta leaks proved, and then subsequently the whole state capture inquiry, the Zondo Commission, has shown us a lot. We'll never know everything. No country ever does. But I think we've done pretty good work in terms of excavating how the Guptas functioned. I would say the one unfortunate thing is that the Guptas took up a lot of air. It has blinded us to many of the other forces that were capturing the ANC at the time. And they became not just a story, but the story. It worked for them for a while. They flew very close to the sun for a long time, and that's on them. And they deserve everything coming to them. And I hope it is as bad as it gets. But they were at once these Rasputin figures that we latched onto as the press and as a people. And also only one of the aspects of the rot that has been eating away at South Africa for the past 12, 13, 14, 15 years.
Richard, have we seen all of the information from the Gupta email, the Gupta leaks actually being released, or is there more still to come?
We keep going through fortunes. When I say we, Amar Bungani just went through a bunch more data and came up with a couple of stories last week on the train contracts. So, the whole point about the leaks themselves is that they will endure, I think, as a cache of information that we can keep going back to when we learn new things down the line. I think all of the real explosive stuff has come out, but they're an incredible journalistic resource that I think journalists in this country will be using for decades, quite frankly, to try to figure out what happened back in the old days. Excavating, trawling through that much material is an incredibly difficult task. It was a real lesson in how you work with data. One that I think has moved South African journalism forward, and perhaps caught us up with best practices to some extent. But it's a hell of a task, and I don't know when we'll reach the bottom of it.
Richard, the last question from my side. What was the most bizarre or surreal or hilarious experience of yours in putting together this movie and in investigating the Guptas?
Oh man, I don't even know where to begin. I think sitting down with Lord Bell for 5 days, we did 25 hours of interviews with him, and he smoked cigarette after cigarette after cigarette. So, 60 cigarettes a day, secondhand smoke in the man's company, while he is explaining how the world actually works. That itself, and that was the first thing we shot, that itself was enough to kind of kick things off into total Dadaist, Salvador Dali territory. It was insane. And it just kind of got weirder and weirder out from there. It's a strange, nasty little movie. And I actually can't wait for South Africans to watch it. I can't wait to bring it home.
So when will we be able to see it either on television or on big screens in South Africa?
So we're going to make a pretty major premiere announcement within the next week or so. So stay posted. There's a Facebook page for Influence. There's a Twitter feed. So hop on there. The announcement should be coming in the next little while. We can't wait to, like I said, we can't wait to show it here. So yeah, announcement coming within, I would say within the next 10 days.
So Richard, tell us, you're in a few film festivals as well.
Mm-hmm.
Which festivals have you entered the movie into?
Well, we were very, very fortunate to premiere in competition at Sundance. I think Diana and myself are the first South African directors to premiere in the international competition for documentaries in Sundance. So that was an enormous honor. We've just played Hot Docs, which is one of the biggest festivals in the world, documentary festivals in the world. We did very well there. We are playing New Zealand Doc Edge this week. That's an Oscar eligible festival. So yeah, the film's doing very, very well. It's traveling the world nicely. But like I say, I mean, I want to show it to South Africans. I want this thing to blow up here.
The final question from my side: when Tim Bell told you these stories, did you actually believe him, or do you think maybe he was doing a bit of his own PR on you and exaggerating his own importance?
Absolutely. I mean, he was spinning us every single second of the way. That's why there's nothing in the film that appears that we haven't fact checked. There was lots of stuff that he said that was completely outlandish, that when we double, triple, quadruple sourced it, panned out. The man lived an absolutely extraordinary life. He was, sui generis, just a wacky, one of a kind dude. So yeah, everything that appears in the film has been fact checked. It's been checked out, and Hama will be very happy to hear that. It's all good, and all of the bullshit we did not make the film, and there was a lot of bullshit.
Well, that's absolutely amazing. I think everyone in South Africa can't wait to see it. It's a piece of our own history that maybe we don't yet understand. And thank you for getting us to a position where maybe we understand a little of what happened during the 8 years or 9 years of the Zuma administration. So Richard, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
Thanks.
So next up is, in fact, we have Sue Kravitz from Impilo. Sue, I think we're having a little difficulty finding you at the moment. So maybe I can just ask you to put your hand up. There Sue is. Sue, if you could turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Okay.
I hope
Hi.
Hi, Sue. How are you doing?
Yes, good, thanks. Hi.
Fantastic. You've been doing some amazing work during COVID and some amazing work generally with Impilo Orphanage. Won't you tell us about it? And while you do, Dan Stillerman's in fact going to be playing a video while you're talking, just to tell us a little bit about Impilo and how people can help you.
Okay, so we're a child protection organization focusing on abandoned children and very young.
Dan, if you could just make that a bit softer, please, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, can I carry on?
Yeah, sorry, Dan will just make it a bit softer as we...
Guys, sorry, just checking. I'm just going to play a couple of seconds. Just tell me if it's soft enough.
No, it's very loud still, Dan.
Still loud.
Okay, give me a moment here.
Or you can even put it on mute and play it.
There we go. Better.
Cool, even softer, Dan. Softer, okay. Softer. Cool, Sue, talk to us.
Okay, I'm going to try and talk over it. So we are a child protection and adoption services. We're a non-profit and we are based in Glen Hazel. We run a small temporary safe care project, and we look after about 150 children in various facilities around Johannesburg and Gauteng. Our aim is to get children into a family as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, we have many abandoned children, and we've found during COVID that the number shot up, which is what we anticipated. Yeah, it's a crisis in South Africa because people are having babies and just simply cannot care for them. We also did a project with helping moms in hospitals have who have nothing. They come in to have their babies and they have absolutely nothing. So we're raising funds for this project to give them a little starter kit for their children.
So how can people help Impilo during this period?
Okay, so obviously we need financial support, but any goods that we could use for our children is on our website. We have a wish list, and then also things for the birth mom packs. Even if it's old jumble that you're looking to get rid of, we circulate that and raise funds from that.
So I think a lot of people probably have baby clothes that their children have grown out of. You'll take something like that?
Absolutely. Anything related to babies, if we don't use it, we circulate it to other homes or we sell it to raise funds.
So tell us, Sue, where can people get hold of you? What's the easiest way for them to get hold of you? I saw there was a drop-off point, was at 20 Lee Avenue in Glen Hazel. So yes. Anyone with baby clothes, nappies, bottles, anything like that, that can help you at 20 Lee Avenue in Glen Hazel. Dan will also, in fact, put your details on the chat right now, as well as your bank account details. So, Dan, I think you've put up the bank account details already. And really amazing, inspirational work that you're doing, and a huge thank you from our community for the fantastic work that you do. It's really warms our hearts at a time like this that there are people like you in our community. Sue, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks to the Jewish Report. Thank you.
Arthur, isn't that inspirational?
It's incredible. It's just amazing to see how much is being done across the community by so many people in so many different areas. Truly inspirational.
You know, when you think of people like Lynn Wallman and what she's done with the Angel Network, when you think of all the people we've highlighted, Kadena, the Hevra Kadisha, all of these people who have gone out. Today I was in fact busy speaking to Reva Foreman and looking at the fact, you know, the soup kitchen being run out of Temple Israel in Hillbrow is still going. It's been going for decades. Wow. There are no Jews even left in that area, but they keep that soup kitchen going and they're still feeding the hungry. And that's like just one of those remarkable inspirational stories. Also, organizations like Africa Awake, who we featured on this program, not to mention Africa Tikkun, who so far have fed 55,000 people with month-long food packs during lockdown. It's truly remarkable. And with that, we'd like to thank another one of our sponsors, and that is Mantis Security, who have been sponsoring a number of these Zoom webinars that we've been having. So Dan, please show us a video from Mantis. And so as unemployment bites and as poverty increases over the lockdown period, so the need for security, in fact, gets more and more. So with that, I would like to welcome onto our panel a fantastic group of panelists. We've introduced Arthur before. Arthur is, in fact, the country's expert on urban legends, having written 6 books on the matter. Nechama Brody, you ran Africa Fact Check. So fantastic to join you. Gus, you are a comedy writer.
Didn't run it.
Oh, you
Sorry.
did run it.
Didn't run it. I worked there. Sorry. Have to fact check that.
Don't allow my Bobbe-Meises to interfere with the point I want to make. Gus, you are one of the country's top experts, comedy writers. You've been writing. I remember you originally from your Style magazine days. That goes back to what, the 1980s?
Correct. 90s and 80s, that's right.
And Howard Feldman, host of the morning show on Chai FM, an author of 4 books, one of the funniest writers you've ever read, the most popular columnist on News 24. So all of you, welcome. So nice to have you here. And I'm going to start by asking each of you of your favorite COVID myth or Bobbe-Meise. And after you tell us about that, we'll do a round of the panel, and then Arthur and I will lead the discussion of the panelists. And just to tell everyone, the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is the button. If you have any questions for any of the people on the panel, please use the Q&A button. So Arthur, tell us your favorite COVID myth.
My favorite one is a favorite because it is so bizarre and absurd on the one hand, but also that it has led to real world consequences on the other hand. And then on the third hand, because in Bobbe-Meises you have 3 hands, it's also so easily provable that it's not true. So this is the belief that 5G networks spread coronavirus. And it is so firmly believed by so many people that you've even had 5G masts, or at least what the people thought were 5G masts. I'm sure they weren't even cellular masts, they're probably radio towers. But because these people are so ignorant, they burnt them down thinking that they're 5G towers. So here's the astonishing thing about 5G and coronavirus. The 3rd country in the world to have a coronavirus epidemic was Iran. Iran is still talking about 5G. They haven't even begun to license it. So if talking about 5G gives you coronavirus, then maybe I should shut up now. But the other really interesting aspect of that is the country in Africa that was the first to have 5G, the first on the whole continent, also has the lowest incidence of coronavirus on the continent. Howard, do you want to guess which country that is?
I'm going to guess maybe Nigeria?
No, it's Lesotho, right next door to us. Because Vodacom are in Lesotho and the government was in a hurry to get things moving there, they agreed to a 5G network being set up already last year. So pretty much the same time as it opened up in China. And as of yesterday, there were a grand total of 4 coronavirus cases in Lesotho. 2 had recovered. The other 2 are still positive. No deaths from coronavirus in Lesotho. So bang goes some people's favorite conspiracy theory.
Amazing. Nechama Brody, tell us about your favorite conspiracy theory.
So I have to be the Jewish mother of the panel, and seeing as I'm also the only female member of the panel. And I don't have a favorite theory, and I also think that from my perspective, working in a fact-checking space for many years, is that I don't like to lead with the false information. This period has unfortunately kind of proven the work that my fact-checking colleagues have been doing for the last nearly decade. And it's tested all of us greatly. And what I've seen is such a groundswell of false information spreading across so many different platforms in so many different ways. And the one thing that I learned when I used to teach fact-checking to journalists, in fact, when I still teach it, is how do you teach corrections? And so I'm going to approach it that way rather than with a favorite theory. Is I think it's very important that we always lead with the truth. And in journalism, we call it a truth sandwich. So you start with the correct information, that's your bread, and then in between you'll have one of the falsehoods, and then you repeat the correction at the end. And the last few months have really been an exercise for me in learning how to share a truth sandwich on multiple different platforms, from my own neighborhood to members of the press that I work with. And it has been incredibly challenging because a lot of people have been incredibly resistant to being corrected, which I knew in advance. Nobody likes to be wrong. We all have our own opinions. And I mean, as Arthur was saying also, it's kind of people have these ideas and they won't let go of them. And I've heard, I don't think I could, you know, if you'd written a book before this about the ridiculous theories that people had come up with, you wouldn't have believed it. And as my fellow novelists always say, truth is much stranger than fiction. But really for me, my least favorite part of all of this has been trying to leap through multiple sources of misinformation that have been graphed, that have been written up as stories, that have been turned into videos. We've had to turn into sort of acrobats, like a circus troupe of fact checkers. And so I don't have a favorite falsehood, and I don't have a favorite correction. I sort of feel it's been an incredibly stressful time, and it really shows how, as a society, over the last few decades, we have been primed. And I think Richard's earlier discussion around even the work that Bell Pottinger does speaks into this, that as a society, we're completely primed to buy into this. And that's something that has always been around. It's part of human nature. It's part of our nature as being social creatures, but it's something that we're going to have to unlearn quite rapidly. Otherwise, we literally will die. So I'm going to stop with that very pleasant statement there and leave it to the rest.
Okay, we'll get back to you a little later, because you can be arrested for spreading falsehoods relating to COVID. And I think we need to talk about how that impacts on a world with an American president who maybe is telling people to ingest Dettol and or Lysol and put ultraviolet lights down their orifices. So we'll come back to that in a second. Gus Silber, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Howard. Am I visible and audible?
You are indeed. Tell us about your favorite Bobbe-Meise.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think, the coronavirus has spread a huge amount of Bobbe-Meise legends, superstitions. I don't think it's too surprising, because if you go back in history, the very word influenza means influence. So Richard's presence here was actually quite apropos as well. So that influence meant the influence of the stars. And there was a bubonic plague in the 14th century where academics at the University of Paris were asked to investigate and come up with their theories on what caused this plague. And they actually said it was caused by the configuration of the heavens. So it took quite a while before scientists and the enlightened kind of world figured out where diseases actually come from. So it's not too surprising. A virus is invisible. And I think what we can't see, we can't understand. And when we can't understand, we're very prone to believing just about anything. I think a big conspiracy theory of the moment, and the one that I personally find quite bizarre and actually quite distressing, is the theory that Bill Gates is kind of the prime evil behind the spread of the coronavirus, and that the virus is actually a plot by Bill Gates and various other figures from the so-called New World Order to get the world in a state where everyone can be vaccinated, and through vaccination can be controlled and monitored. It's so easily disprovable. And I made the mistake the other night of getting into a very short argument with someone on Twitter about this. They sent me a whole bunch of really bizarre information about what Roosevelt said and about what George Soros said. And it's a completely crazy theory. I mean, as if it isn't bad enough that Bill Gates has given the world Microsoft Office, we have to contend with the theory that he's going to give us all vaccines, and through that vaccine control they monitor us. Arthur spoke about 5G, and that also for me is actually one of my favorite conspiracy theories. But I saw the other day, the BBC reported on this, someone came up with a 5G bionic device, which costs the equivalent of 6,000 Rand. And you can buy this, and it does all sorts of things to save you from 5G radiation, and therefore potentially save you from the virus as well. And a computer expert investigated, and it turns out that the device is nothing but a USB drive, and at that 128 gigabyte USB drive, that's it over there. And it's got holographic nano layer technology, quantum biological shielding technology. And I thought that this is human nature in a nutshell. We don't understand what's going on. There's vast ignorance. Some people understand, some people don't. And when you have a huge amount of ignorant people, they're very susceptible to being conned. But for me, this is a good example of monetizing ignorance and stupidity. And some people have bought this in the hope that it'll save them from 5G radiation. And somehow, bizarrely, as Arthur mentioned, 5G has become associated with the pandemic. So yeah, it's incredibly worrying, but at the same time, elements of human nature come into this. And it's actually not terribly different from what happened during the plagues of medieval years, where the stars were thought to be behind pandemics. So I think humans are generally susceptible to the most bizarre theories, because it gives us some comfort to think that we know the real truth. And it's very, very hard to dissuade people. Nagama, Africa Check, Snopes, all of these sources online, Google. It's so easy to disprove something, but there's a massive, massive resistance to being told that you're wrong. And I've kind of learned better not to be involved in those arguments. So like Arthur, 5G is my current favorite Bobbe-Meise.
Gus, where do you stick that USB, 5,000 Rand USB thing in order to prevent you getting the COVID?
I think you're just supposed to put it in your computer, and as you use your electronic device, it saves you from radiation. It's completely bizarre. But the fact that I think if you were to sell it for £10, people might not want to buy it. But the fact that they're selling it for 6,000 Rand means it must surely work. So once again, an entrepreneurial initiative never dies. There's always room for it.
Howard, actually it works by sucking on it, the same way that people suck this stuff out of their thumbs.
So Howard Feldman, are you the person who's been drinking lemon tea and water every 15 minutes to keep the virus away, and then spraying yourself maybe with some was it lead spray or something? Let's unmute you.
I'm not sure that lead has, am I unmuted? Okay,
Yep.
so yeah, I'm not sure that lead has ever been particularly successful. But actually, I want to go back even a little bit further, because one of my least favorite biblical stories takes place about a year after the children of Israel leave Egypt. And off they go, and they encounter all of these amazing miracles. They form judicial systems, and then they get to Israel, where they were traveling towards, and they decide that they're going to send in 12 representatives, 12 spies, to see what this land is going to be like. So off they go. They choose one from each tribe. They go into the land, and they all see the same thing, of course, because they all observe the same thing, and they come back with very different reports. 10 of them speak with absolute horror about what they encountered, and 2 of them say, well, it's absolutely awesome. And I find that interesting. As I said, it is one of my least favorite stories. It just doesn't go anywhere, and it results in the children of Israel wandering aimlessly around the desert for 40 years, which has to be incredibly unpleasant. But what was so interesting about it is it's all about objective, and it's all about bias, and it's all about the view that they had. Now, why is that important? Is that we know what Bobbe-Meises is fake news. It's stories your grandmother tells. But what is also damaging, I think, is narrative news. And that is when we have a bias about what we're reporting on. Now, I think that COVID-19 has highlighted this in a number of ways. And one of the ways, we joke about this Donald Trump and drinking all of this stuff, and I think maybe he should give it a bash, see what it's like. But in fact, one of the things that he did say earlier on was he spoke about this hydroxychloroquine, and don't ask me to pronounce it correctly because I can't. And until he had mentioned it, why I got involved in the discussion, nobody knows. It wasn't a very smart thing to do. But until he had mentioned it, this was one of the protocols that people were looking at. He then speaks about it. 2 complete morons in the United States drink, they drink fish tank cleaning solution. One of them wakes up dead, the other one with a sore stomach. And to be fair, if they had lived in the 19th century, they wouldn't have survived anyway. Darwin would have made sure that they would have run into a fire, not away from a fire. It's unlikely that in any other century besides the one that we're currently living in, these 2 people would have survived. Either way, one did, one didn't. And of course, everybody becomes a bit hysterical about this hydroxychloroquine. All of a sudden, the Lancet publication publishes a finding produced by a very strange laboratory institution until then unheard of, called Surgisphere. And what Surgisphere claim is that this drug is causing deaths all over the world. It's not particularly well fact-checked, that nobody examines and scrutinizes the data. It gets printed in Lancet. The World Health Organization read it, and they say, oh, no, we're halting this. We're halting all further studies of this. It then turns out that this company, Surgisphere, is run by a adult film actor and a science fiction writer. Lancet apologized for it. They, of course, retracted, and now the World Health Organization is back on track with looking into the study. And why, again, is that important is I wonder if it wasn't for most of our disdain for the behavior of Donald Trump, if the media would have been so quick to report on some of these stories, and if Lancet would have not done a little bit more work. Of course, we don't know that, but I believe that there's an incredible narrative bias that I believe is dangerous. Now, we see this every day. I see this every day when I'm looking at what I'm going to write about and what I'm not going to write about, what I'm going to be talking about on my show and what I'm not going to be, what I'm writing in the Jewish Report that is often going to have me being called a self-hating Jew, told that my late mother would be horribly disappointed in me, that I don't understand Judaism, that I have no faith, etc. on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm a right-wing fanatic, I'm a baby sympathizer, killer, I'm a communist, I'm all sorts of things the minute I write on a subject that doesn't agree with people's narrative. And as Nechama said earlier, the most difficult thing there is to do is to try and change a position that somebody is entrenched in. That's why I believe most people on this panel actually are in the space that they're in, because we have an uncontrollable, I think, desire to seek the truth. And certainly that's why I do what I do. But it doesn't make it easy, because we all have those biases, including everyone on the panel, and certainly including myself. And those are the types of things that I believe COVID-19 has highlighted tremendously.
So Nechama, let's throw the ball back to you. In fact, is Howard right? Is there a political agenda in everything that journalists are in fact producing, either deliberately or inadvertently?
I think there's an agenda in everything that everyone is producing, not just journalists. And when I teach journalism students and when I teach fact checkers, it's important that we remember that everybody, including the World Health Organization, has an agenda. So when you get information from a certain source, some agendas might be what we consider positive, some might be less positive. So Bell Pottinger didn't have a nice agenda, but everybody has an agenda, and we have to start from that premise and not assume that there is something that exists that's called kind of unbiased or objective journalism. Even the way we represent facts contains a lot of bias, the way we collect facts. When we do research, we understand that who we are, the position that we come from, the kind of person that we are, will influence the type of questions that we ask. We may not know enough to ask better questions or to ask more questions. So we always have to assume that there is an agenda. We always have to assume that there's bias. And for me, fact checking is not about becoming some kind of like super correct person where you're always right, but it's about following a replicable method that you can check information in the same way every time. So there's no information that gets exempted from that. You don't say, oh, well, because this information comes from someone I like, I won't check it, but this information comes from a source that I don't like, so I am going to check it. We have to check all of the information all of the time using the same methods. And when we do that, that is something approaching a scientific method, which if you study or practice science, you'll also know that the scientific method isn't about right and wrong. It's about following the same steps all of the time and changing your mind, or changing your view or changing your opinion when new information presents itself. And if you do that, you can eventually find a place of accuracy, if not a place of truth. But the challenge is that we want to leapfrog those kind of processes. We want to be much quicker. And the problem, as Howard was saying about the study, is there's such a rush to be first, and the news makes this mistake all the time. And this is very frustrating for me in South Africa, not just globally. There's a rush to be first, and I always caution, rather be second and right than first and wrong. We're seeing a lot of very, very dangerous headlines and very dangerous reporting going out in this rush to be first.
A few years ago, you gave a talk at something called a Knowledge Summit on how to question information. Can you give us a 2-sentence or half-a-minute summary of what you told your audience? How do you go about practically checking information?
So I actually just discussed this in some classes that I was teaching this week, and I'm hoping I can remember it well enough. But the basic processes should remain consistent. And I think Africa Check put out a very interesting way of approaching this a while ago, which is if you read information that makes you feel particularly satisfied or particularly outraged, you should check it even more, right? So your emotional response to information shouldn't stop you from taking these steps. But the first thing that you need to do is to check the source. You should always try and find the original source of the information. You should try and assess if it's a credible source or not. And by credible, this is now we start kind of getting into complicated stuff, because people have apparently very different ideas of what is credible and what's not. But you should start by checking the source. You should then make an effort to see if the content actually matches what is said. So, is that content in the source itself, and is it correct? And then you should also check the context, which is how is this information being used? And this is where a lot of us fumble, is that we assume that we understand the context because we think we understand the topic well. And what I keep telling my journalism students is your job as a journalist is not to know everything. It's to know how to find people who know that thing that you are trying to understand. And I wish that as humans, we would do that more. I have been lectured about graphs by advocates. I mean, law advocates, the ones who boss people around in court, who've tried to explain how logarithmic graphs work, who have no experience in public medicine or epidemiology. And, I question myself all the time, and I've been reporting on health for more than 20 years, and I teach literacy about data, and I question a lot. And then people come with extreme amount of confidence, and I think we should have less confidence in our ability to understand the context and maybe step back sometimes. That would help.
Arthur, can I ask you, because Twitter took an unprecedented step last week and they started marking Donald Trump's tweets as something you should fact check. Like, is that a very slippery slope when a technology company or a platform starts determining whether a politician is telling the truth or not?
Not at all. In fact, if you look at Facebook's investment in fact-checking, working with organizations like Africa Check, and Nechama will have experience of that, you would think that if they flag something or if their users flag something as fake, they put the fact-checkers onto it, and these are professionals not aligned with Facebook worldwide, checking it, and then confirm that it's not fact or that it's false, then they have a responsibility to at least flag it or remove it from their platform. Because as we've seen, the belief in urban legends, hoaxes, hysteria leads to damage and it leads to death. So it's not something as simple as, oh, it doesn't do any harm to spread this story. That's what I've often heard from people spreading urban legends. It doesn't do any harm to make people aware. Of course it harms. It kills, in fact. So they do have a responsibility. And Twitter are late to that party, but Facebook, for its part, is very lame in that party. They appoint all these fact checkers, and then all they do with the verified, if I can use that term, verified falsity or falsehoods, is that they downrate it in the news feeds. In other words, it still appears, so they can still generate advertising revenue from it.
Howard Feldman, shouldn't we presume that all politicians are in fact lying all the time, and therefore you can presume that you can't actually believe a word that any of them say?
I don't have that kind of a level of cynicism, I have to say. Maybe I should, maybe I'm naive, but I do believe that there actually are a lot of people around who do want to tell the truth. The problem is that I think people do get caught up with trying to sell a story. And when you start to sell the story and when you start to sell a narrative, it obviously becomes dangerous, because you do present what you want to present. So should we, it's interesting, I don't know, I've got an attitude quite differently when I have somebody on my show, for example, whether it's somebody who I like or don't like in terms of being a politician, I'm happy to give them a chance to actually put something forward. Whereas a lot of the style of, let's say, other interviewers is to challenge and keep challenging. I do think that people should be given an opportunity, but I think they'll prove themselves to be a liar or not a liar soon enough.
Well, Gus, a question that's come in from Paul, who's busy watching us, is what is the limit on fact checking? Does one ban references to the Tooth Fairy and the Loch Ness Monster? You know, does one refuse to put in stories about Santa Claus into a publication?
Yeah, so I think it's important to distinguish between what we call myths and superstition and the reality of everyday news. You know, I think personally, and as a very active Twitter user and as a member of neighborhood WhatsApp groups and so on, I think a lot of people are beginning to kind of realize that it is essential and that it is actually easy to check information. I see this a lot on my local WhatsApp groups. So we're talking about myths and legends around the coronavirus, but there are also a number around lockdown itself. And you'll find someone will come onto a WhatsApp group, which is a much more intimate way of spreading news. And they'll come with, I saw this and was forwarded by somebody, and it says that, for instance, one that came up this week, there's going to be a massive petrol shortage on level 3, and you'd better all go and fill up now. And this is a message forwarded from several generations of other WhatsApp groups. And I find that this is very quickly nipped in the bud by WhatsApp administrators who are quite fearful about the possibility of being charged under the lockdown, the Disaster Act legislations. So I'm kind of fairly optimistic, actually, in an odd way, about the ability of people to use technology to debunk myths and rumors. And it often turns into vicious arguments, actually. But I do think people are beginning to realize that it's important to seek the truth. And I think people at large are able to tell the difference between absolute fairy tales. And I think fairy tales are good. I think myths, legends, superstitions are good for us because they go to our primal kind of origins. You know, we're told these stories when we're young, and we read fiction because we love these stories, but it's very important to be able to distinguish fiction from fact. It's all very well for Facebook and Twitter and so on to identify possible fake news and inaccuracies. I personally, this is just me, I find it a little bit condescending. I'd rather find out myself. I approach everything that Trump says and other politicians say with a very skeptical mind. I don't really need Facebook to tell me with a little red flag that this isn't true. At the same time, I can see why they're doing it because they have, they have constituencies to protect. But I do see actively on Twitter in particular, which is a very, very fast moving and active stream, I do see people very quickly coming up and debunking. But of course, some people don't want their cherished beliefs to be debunked. Journalists have a responsibility to do this, but of course, anyone who uses social media can equally do it. I think it's a good thing. I have seen it happening more and more during the virus.
So that's also what people don't know about you and I, is that, because I've never spoken about it to anyone, is that you introduced me to urban legends. You loaned me a book called The Vanishing Hitchhiker about a century ago, and that turned me on to urban legends. So I'd like to ask you what your favorite South African urban legend is about the coronavirus.
Okay, I don't have a legend that springs strictly to mind, but Dan, if I could just ask you to show this tweet from Yusuf Abramji. This is one that amused me quite a lot. The cigarette tweet. Okay, well, let me just read it. It's very short. Yusuf Abramji is a very well-known anti-crime activist. Yeah, there it comes up now. He's a very well-known anti-crime activist. He's also, and quite openly, a lobbyist for the tobacco industry, specifically tobacco and its contribution to taxes and so on. He posted this on May 26th, passing on a message that a listener had said on Radio 702, saying, "Children are now using cocaine because it's cheaper than tobacco. This is a real worry." Now, this is completely bizarre. This is an absolute, a very fine example of a legend. It's just absolutely not possible. I mean, I'm not sure what the street value of cocaine is, but it's definitely more expensive than tobacco. And the kind of idea with this tweet is that, okay, if you're going to let your children kind of become addicted, make sure they're addicted to tobacco, because at least then they'll be contributing in some way to the fiscus. So this tweet gave me quite a laugh, and Yusuf came under a flurry of attacks from people, most of them being very amused by that insinuation. Yeah, 500 rand a gram for decent cocaine. So this is one of the kind of lighter moments of myths and legends being shared online. But Yusuf is somebody with a lot of following. He is, by any definition, an influential user And I think by passing this on, he wasn't simply passing on information. He was actually kind of trying to, in some way, boost the tobacco lobby.
So Arthur, just tell us, what is in the mind of these weird individuals who make up these stories and put them out? What is the intention? Why would someone do something so ridiculous?
I got an inkling of why people do it in a WhatsApp group that I became part of for a while. I eventually left it in despair at the inability to convince people that these were made up stories. What it came down to was that people desperately need validation for their own worldview. And anything that validates that is treated as true, and anything that tries to contradict it is treated not just as false, but in fact the enemy of truth. And this is, for example, what you find with rabid supporters of Donald Trump. Anything that criticizes him is regarded as fake news and a product of the biased radical far left, regardless of how centrist it might be. And anything that backs him, regardless of how bizarre it is treated as this is the authentic truth. So that's just one example. I'm not here to bash Donald, because I'm sure everyone else will do that for me. But the sense of being validated in your worldview lies behind not just the conspiracy theories, but also urban legends, as Gus said earlier, people who feel that they have a handle on the truth. In fact, Richard said earlier that people feel that they understand what's really happening in the world. So they like to believe the conspiracy theories.
Well, can I ask the panelists a question as well? It's a fascinating on the subject. Is the fact that what Arthur's saying in that we become more and more uncomfortable with a view that isn't our own view. Last week, the New York Times published an opinion piece, and I can't remember the name of the senator. And he's a Republican senator, and he wrote an article which was a little worrying, maybe a little offensive, about bringing the army onto the streets in order to deal with what was going on. What happened was a lot of the New York Times journalists threatened to leave. Eventually, the New York Times apologized for doing so and said that from now on, they're going to publish less opinions. And to me, that was a very, very big concern, not because obviously I agree with what the guy said, but just because it plays into how we seem to deal with anything that doesn't fit within our own comfort zone and our own narrative.
Yeah, I'm actually trying to so this is an important issue. And it actually talks, I was going to bring it up anyway in response to what you said earlier, that you like to have different people on your show and you like to talk to them. And I think that coming from a perspective as a journalist is that we need to step away from this idea that there are two sides to a story. And because that creates often what we call either we create a false balance, or we create false equivalency, where we have actual public health experts on the one hand and completely non-educated people in the public, and we make out as if they have the same space. But this idea of kind of that stories have both sides. So when you were talking about the op-ed that was published in the New York Times, which was encouraging bringing in the troops against protesters, there was a journalist online who tweeted, he said, "This is, to me, is a core problem in journalism. Racism is not a disagreement. Vaccines are not a disagreement. Climate change is not a disagreement. Smoking causing cancer is not a disagreement. Publishing these things treats them as valid disagreements." And there is a massive challenge to all of us where people say, oh yeah, but if you don't publish those messages, it's like censorship. No, it's not like censorship at all. Go and study censorship and see what censorship is about. But we have to, as people who have some level of power, whether you're a journalist or a host or you work on a platform, is to stop platforming ideas like this. There aren't two sides to climate change. There are not two sides to racism. I mean, and I think, as I'm assuming we're speaking to predominantly a Jewish community, there are not two sides to Nazism. How would you feel about Nazis and right-wingers having an open platform as often as they wanted to? Because, hey, free speech, guy, we're not in America. They have very bizarre free speech laws there that I don't necessarily think work for us. But I mean, if you cannot understand why it is important that Nazis have lots of spaces to talk in, okay? They can talk in their living rooms, they can talk in their dining rooms, they can have little Nazi brides with all their Nazi friends and compare swastika tattoos if they want to. But it is not our obligation as the press to give them a space to broadcast their views. And that is also why organizations like Twitter, Facebook, or social media actually getting involved in what is allowed and what is permitted and what isn't is important. And I think we really need to distinguish platforming views that present themselves as that, as opposed to censorship. That's not censorship by saying we don't want to actually listen to your rubbish. And that's really hard, though, because as Arthur also raised, is that people's worldviews don't like to be challenged. It's incredibly hard. When we researched why people are resistant to being corrected, is the stronger or the more closely aligned an issue is to a person's worldview, the less likely they are to be able to actually take on any corrections. And it is so hard for us from a fact-checking perspective to think, how do you get people to even be willing to consider that there might be something that they weren't aware of before? We haven't figured that out yet, by the way. Sometimes
I want to actually ask the question, because I think you bring up an important point. Because some of our politicians, let us, for example, take Julius Malema, is often inherently racist in what he says. And yet the media give him the platform. If the media denied him the platform...
Sorry, he's racist to who, Howard?
Often, in many of his comments
to who? Who is he racist towards?
Well, we can go and look at some of these things, but there is no doubt in my mind...
Are you saying that he's racist towards whites?
Often, yeah, could be, or other people.
And so my opinion on this is that you don't get reverse racism. Racism is structural. Okay, racism is about systems of power. Racism is something that people who have historically and traditionally been in power, which would be men and white people, but white people have been in power. It's about those systems. So I don't believe that blacks can be racist towards white. Yes, I can believe they can say hate speech and say terrible things, but I don't believe it's racism.
Yeah, your argument is is to say that Jewish people who've been the victims of racism for centuries cannot be racist against other people.
It's anti-Semitism.
No, I'm terribly sorry. You are incorrect. Jews have been victimized and been subject to racism for centuries, and by your view, they cannot be racist. And we all know racists...
Jews are terrible racists.
Well, according to your definition, they can't be, because structurally they're the victims.
No, you've conflated two things. I think that anti-Semitism is also structural, and that is why we can't conflate it with other bigotry and discrimination. But I think anti-Semitism is different to racism. Racism, we clearly understand, is discrimination against Black people and people of color who have been discriminated against on the basis of their color. Anti-Semitism, in the term we use it, doesn't just mean discrimination against Semites. We use it specifically to mean discrimination systemic and long-term sustained discrimination against Jews that's persisted for centuries, as has racism. Two different things. Misogyny is also systematic, systemic discrimination against women, and it's not the same as anti-Semitism or racism, but they all exist, by the way.
I must say, cannot disagree with you more, because I know Black people who are inherently racist, and the mere fact that you are prepared to allow them to get off the hook because they're a Black person, to me, is inherently unacceptable.
I think it's just a question of words, and you want to put them on a hook for something that they sort of can't technically commit in terms of racism. You maybe need to find different words to describe what they're doing.
I'm sorry, your definition is not an acceptable definition. I'm sorry. But I do want to, to me, absolutely. But we're all entitled to that opinion. But I want to actually poll an opinion now, because I want to know, for example, whether in fact, and we're going to ask our audience now, whether in fact the COVID virus was created in a laboratory in Wuhan. So we're going to take a few minutes and we're going to ask the audience. That's one of the great conspiracy stories out there, or maybe true story. We're going to ask people whether they believe it was created in a laboratory in Wuhan, and we're going to allow another 15 seconds for people to actually vote. And while they do, let's quickly go around the panel. Arthur, yes or no? Was it created in a laboratory in Wuhan?
A lot of people would like it to have been created there because that would confirm their worldview. But there's enough fact, there's enough evidence to show that it couldn't have been created in a laboratory. And you just have to follow the medical trail, the medical research trail.
Gus, laboratory.
I think if this coronavirus was a unique, discrete, one-of-a-kind event in history, one might be able to look at that as a theory. But there've been pandemics going back, to the beginning of humanity. In fact, there's a theory that viral pandemics are a result of our agrarian roots. And if we hadn't settled with animals, there wouldn't have been spillover transmissions and so on. But there's more than enough evidence that viruses, this kind of virus, the origin can quite easily be traced throughout history. I think it's a crazy theory, and I think it's nice for people to think that it's got such a simple origin, but it's much more complex than that. So my answer is definitely no.
Howard Feldman?
I have absolutely no idea. I don't think we have, I don't know how anybody could know. We just don't, we don't know. It could have been made in a laboratory in New Zealand. There's nothing else going on there. So I think that's actually where it started. No, I've got no idea. I think we'll have to just wait for something definitive either way. I don't think you can, I think unless you know that it has been definitively, then you have to assume that it hasn't.
Well, 40% of the people watching us tonight, and we have at the moment probably about 1,300 people, 1,400 people watching us who've polled on Zoom, say 40% of people say, yes, it was definitely created in a Wuhan laboratory, and 60% of people say no.
Howard, if I can just give that some context, there is a tremendous amount of evidence that can be tracked, traced, and trailed to the way the virus emerged and was transmitted. There's not a single shred of evidence that shows it to have been developed in a lab. Yes, there are a lot of YouTube videos that show that.
Yes, some very compelling ones, actually quite enjoyable. I mean, it doesn't make them true, but it's just quite enjoyable to watch.
So when it comes down to this, there seems to be a political agenda. And that political agenda is an anti-Chinese agenda. So are we suggesting that, for example, the 40% of people who in the last poll suggested that it was created in a Wuhan laboratory are in fact the Donald Trump viewers of the world? Gus, what do you think of that?
Well, Donald Trump has certainly gone out of his way to link this virus to Wuhan, calling it the Wuhan virus, despite the World Health Organization, pretty much making it clear that Trump is incredibly influential, like it or not. And when he says something, he's got a massive base of people who are going to tune into his words. I don't know. Look, I think it's very likely that a lot of people who believe the virus originated in the laboratory are not at all Trump supporters. I don't think it's just him who is making that claim. It just goes back to what people feel comfortable with. And there's something comfortable about the thought that this is a human-made and human-spread virus that originated for geopolitical reasons in a laboratory in Wuhan. It seems comfortable enough to satisfy people's needs for simple, easy solutions. The virus is incredibly complex. It's completely unpredictable. We don't know when the second and third waves are going to come, if they come. It's incredibly scary, and where there is fear, there's misunderstanding and ignorance. So it's not surprising that people would look for an easy answer. But yeah, Trump is very largely to blame for that, but I don't think it's just him.
Nechama?
I just want to say there's a long history of using terms like this when we talk about pandemics and illness globally. And I think this is also where we can see the ease with which we want to call it a Chinese virus or believe that when there is no evidence that supports that at all. But we look at how in the past, different communities have been blamed for disease. This has happened in South Africa when we've had outbreaks of bubonic plague in the Western Cape. And this has happened globally where, Jews were accused of spreading disease. So we understand that it's quite useful for communities to be able to point to an other, that it's somebody else other than you, and particularly somebody who you consider dirty or somebody who you consider to have cultural practices other than you. They eat different food to you, they behave differently, they wash or bathe differently perhaps. And one of the things that continues to interest me is the first time the world really paid attention to what was going on was when white Europeans started to die. And that changed the way we covered I mean, obviously this was obviously when it had reached pandemic proportions, but when it was only Chinese people, the world was less interested, in the same way as that when HIV first came to South Africa, and in fact for many years afterwards, but it initially started off as a disease within the gay community. And then when a different strain of HIV reached South Africa through transport routes, affected mostly Black South Africans. And that didn't really concern the apartheid government, who weren't very interested in gays or Blacks. So we always see that when it affects people that are close to us, we pay attention to it in a different way. But it's very useful to blame a disease on the other. You know, there's a long history of othering people.
So can we ask the question as well, the issue of lockdown and whether lockdown has been correct or not, seems to once again have been a big issue of political contention. Arthur?
Sorry, I froze there for a moment. There's a lot of debate around lockdown, but people miss the point about lockdown, and that was to delay the spread of the virus, not to stop the spread of the virus. It was to give the country a chance to prepare its infrastructure. But most people seem to have interpreted it as an attempt to stop the virus. And now that we've come out of phase 5 and phase 4 lockdown, and the numbers are increasing dramatically, far more than previously, people are saying, see, lockdown didn't work. But in fact, this is exactly what was predicted when a lockdown was first decided on. It was predicted that once we came out of lockdown, the numbers would escalate. And it was for that reason that time was needed to stop it from exploding while the country wasn't ready. We're probably still not ready, but we're far more ready than we ever were before.
Well, there appears to be this entire theory that, in fact, the dangers of lockdown were far greater to the population than the dangers of the virus. Howard, what do you think of that? There's a South African Nobel laureate who seems to have expressed a view on this on the subject.
Yeah, so I think that the problem with a successful lockdown is its success. In other words, if we didn't have lockdown and hospitals were overwhelmed and they weren't taking in anybody over the age of 55 because they couldn't cope with it, well, then we would scream about the fact that we were overwhelmed and people were dying. I do think that a lockdown has largely been successful. Yes, we know that certain aspects of it have been irrational. But at the same time, I keep thinking that there isn't a country in the world that's got this perfectly right. As Nakama said a little bit earlier, information is coming so quickly and everybody's trying to process the information. We see reports, and again, it's back to that political thing. Lockdown, Sweden didn't lock down. Look how successful, until their death per capita is in fact much higher than anyone else. And there's a study, an investigation around that. And as one of the comments that Dr. Anton Marburg made to me is that although they didn't even have an official lockdown, people still actually did adhere to that type of advice. The same thing in Amsterdam. So I do think it's become political. I think it is the one thing that inspired me in the earlier days was how all of the opposition parties in the ANC were very much on the same page. America didn't have one day of that as a matter of interest. They were divided from day one, and they never could quite get with that program as a unified nation. I happen to think I'm still very proud of South Africa. I think we've done very well, and we've made certain mistakes and we'll continue to make certain mistakes. But the reality is that it's only going to be in a year's time that we'll be able to look at all the countries and to be able to assess who really did well in terms of their approach and who didn't. I think it is too early to tell, but maybe my view is we're going to have to is that everybody is trying. I really do believe that most governments are trying, including our own, and let's see what happens.
So Gus, there's a story that came out that in fact Chuck Norris had died of COVID. But no matter what happens, Chuck Norris seems to be dying of everything, and he's still very much alive and well at the moment. What is it why would someone spread a rumor of Chuck Norris's premature demise?
Okay, so Chuck Norris is a classic example of an internet meme. And that meme, a meme is a discrete bit of information that gets spread virally. And Chuck Norris I think he's much loved on the internet. And who knows? I mean, I've got no idea whether Chuck Norris is actually alive or dead. I'd have to Google that. But
no, he's alive. I checked that today.
Yeah, but it's no surprise that Chuck Norris is regarded as invincible because of his tough guy persona in the movies. He's a strong, silent type. He hardly ever says anything, and he's regarded as indestructible in the very same way as Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones is. So if either Richards or Chuck Norris had to go, especially if they had to go because of the virus, it would be an absolute disaster. I think those are two benchmarks. You'll find there's a huge potential and a huge amount of humor surrounding the virus at large, and it's not surprising when times are dark, people look for a lighter relief. But you'll find memes. I mean, you can't open WhatsApp without being flooded by memes. You can't go onto Twitter without being flooded by them. So, the term viral, which is an internet social media term, kind of seems to have been engulfed by what viral really means in everyday practice. But yeah, I think Chuck Norris is kind of a benchmark.
So, Nakama,
as long as he's surviving.
Nakama, there's a question that comes in and says, is it perhaps possible that conspiracy theories are the result of people not being able to accept actual reality and would like to glamorize the truth, our inherent need to make life more interesting?
So when we study how false information, and there's different types of false information. There is false information that is shared without meaning to cause harm, which some of the people who are researching this, they'll call this misinformation. So your auntie forwards a hoax on WhatsApp, but she didn't really mean it badly. She just shared it because she thought it was interesting. And then you also get disinformation, which is where it's false information that is deliberately shared to cause harm. And causing harm could mean a wide range of things. What we find over the last few years is the internet has allowed a proliferation of what are described as alternative news websites. And many of these exist along the spectrum of the right wing, but there are also left-wing alt news websites, including ones that deny vaccines work and all that sort of stuff. And what alt news websites often do is they take a real event, and I'm using this in the context of conspiracy theories, they take a real news event, that grain of truth that Richard Poplak was talking about earlier, and they create an alternative version of that same event. So they'll be saying that, 9/11 was a controlled demolition, or that Sandy Hook was a fake thing, or that there were 2 shooters in a mass shooting event when there were only 1. And when they study how information gets shared between different groups of people, it shows you also the kind of worldviews that they buy into. And what these alt media websites are deliberately setting out to do is they exploit these kind of gaps in our worldviews and our makeups. And what I've learned from that is when somebody believes, for example, that 9/11 was a controlled explosion and not a terrorist attack, you can't just correct them on the facts of that. So it's not just that they want to be glamorous, but because they've bought into a much bigger world system where they believe that their government is lying to them. And so everything that they believe is going to fall in line with that. And when we talk about, do people want to believe in conspiracy theories because it's more dramatic or glamorous than the truth? It is partly because the truth is often quite boring and quite banal. Sometimes, even when it involves people dying, it's often not a Hollywood movie. And it's not very dramatic. It's very boring and really, really horrible because of that level, but also because the worldviews that people have always probably subscribed to, we just see them expressed in different ways now, teach them that the media is not to be trusted, that scientists are not to be trusted, that governments are lying to you. And we saw this come out a lot during the lockdown in South Africa, where people started expressing a lot of dissent around lockdown. When I say people, I mean small groups of people. But that was also very much about, we don't trust this government. And it was quite hard, I think, for South Africans to go into lockdown feeling this sense of complete reassurance initially with, the elbow bump and my fellow South Africans, and that sort of feeling of unity, and how quickly that frayed, and how quickly large groups of audiences reverted to type, which is, we don't trust the government, we don't believe what they're telling us, they're doing something wrong. So I think there's less glamour. It appears glamorous because it's very dramatic. And we must keep in mind that dramatic stuff tends to be shared much more quickly than boring things. So if somebody said to you, Howard Feldman, has like he, I don't know, had a white kipper on the other day, it wouldn't be very exciting. You wouldn't share it. But if it was like Howard Feldman went around wearing a giant hat with a huge feather in it, it would be much more shareable. So the more dramatic something is, the more shareable it is. But also because our worldviews, unfortunately, have fractured, where we don't trust anybody anymore. And unfortunately, the people we do trust tend to be our friends and family for news and information, which, as much as I love my friends and family, and I love my dad, I grew up asking my dad everything, you know, driving in the car, what's that, Abba, what's this, whatever. And I used to believe him. And as an adult, I realized he doesn't actually know everything. So we need to step outside that comfort zone of who we trust, which is not that radical, really, when you say go ask a scientist.
Well, let's actually poll our audience on the question we asked earlier on whether, in fact, lockdown was right or wrong. So there's a poll up at the moment, and we're going to give people 30 seconds or so. Was lockdown right or wrong? And we'll have about 30 seconds. But while people are doing that, Howard Feldman, have we lost our sense of humor? In the beginning of COVID, there were lots of memes. There was lots of joking around. When our president put his mask on the incorrect way, it was endearing and it was lovable. But have we lost our sense of humor the longer this has gone on?
I don't think South Africans will ever lose their sense of humor, because it's the way in which we've survived. It's our survival mechanism. It might be a little dormant right now as we become, as Nakama said, a bit frayed. I do think there is that going on. And what I am seeing as well is when I write humorous pieces, there's actually sometimes quite an angry response to it, which tells me that in many ways we're actually not okay about laughing about at certain things. So yes, I do think that we are a little bit more serious. Actually, quite interesting is we do a poll every Monday, and in an organization, Synthesis, that I'm involved with, and every week we ask them how people are feeling. And we give them 10 emojis, and they all correspond to a word. Mostly in the past, people are feeling cool, inspired, happy. What I've noticed in the last while is we're getting the answer meh. M-E-H, and that's that funny sort of that bland face. And I'm seeing more and more meh around. I mean, this is just a sample of 150 people, but I do think that South Africans are feeling meh. And when you're feeling meh, you don't feel like laughing.
Yeah. So just to share the results of our poll, 88% of people say the lockdown was in fact correct. 7% of people are not sure, and only 4% of people actually think the lockdown was incorrect, which was amazing, because if you follow social media, and so many people on social media who are espousing theories about the lockdown that would not give you this overwhelming support that comes. So I want to ask Gus Silber. Gus, are you also finding that people are maybe losing their sense of humor over this?
I think there's ample evidence that South Africans are actually finding their sense of humor. I mean, look at the famous Zol song, the DJ, I forget his name, his first name is Max, but he took a soundbite from Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma about saliva and Zol and the sharing of cigarettes, and he turned it into a highly danceable dance track that seemed to give a lot of people reason to laugh and reason to kind of feel, that we still can poke fun at our politicians, which is very much a South African thing. It is a very serious situation, and I think in all of our lifetimes we've never experienced anything like it. You know, the word surreal is used over and over. You wake up in the morning from a lockdown dream and you wonder if your dream was actually real, or whether the reality that you're about to be experiencing is the real dream. But I think, and I we saw Conrad earlier on in Chester Missing, I think that this crisis that we're going through provides a lot of reason to laugh, and it provides a huge amount of material to laugh. If you follow Madam and Eve, for instance, they've chronicled the lockdown in a very sweet, actually, and warm way. And they've also managed to get a lot of humor out of it. I don't think that your sense of humor disappears when you go through a crisis. I think it's something that kind of reappears. And I certainly hope we're never in a position where South Africans as a whole lose their sense of humor. You know, stand-ups, there's an excellent stand-up called Gilly Apter, who's been doing amazing work on Zoom from the comfort of her home. It's really necessary, I think, to find one sense of humor to temper the terrible news of the day. And I think it is happening.
So Nakama, one of the comments that has come is, why are you blaming all the grannies and the aunties for spreading these stories? Surely, but one does get a sense that in fact the main proponents of spreading fake news are in fact men.
I think it's a mix. It's easy to say granny and auntie on WhatsApp because it's less threatening, and you know, men don't always, I found honestly in my experiences that men don't respond well to being challenged about the false news that they spread on social media. I've seen this in my suburbs WhatsApp group. So I did say, in fairness, I mentioned advocates earlier, and also my father. And I think, you know, all of us have participated at some point in distributing some version of false information. It's just a question of how false or how serious that information is. What I found, especially at the early stage of the pandemic, just as lockdown was being imposed, was there was a lot of discussion around graphs. So people were trying to understand the pandemic through particularly logarithmic graphs, which are quite complicated and not easy to read. And we didn't actually have enough data in South Africa to plot it logarithmically at that point, because it plots exponential growth, which you can't do when you have 4 cases, just saying. But I found that men in particular were very invested in showing how well they could graph the virus, and not only men, but a lot of them. And it kind of, they couldn't understand why they were so good with maths, but they didn't get this, and they weren't getting it. And so it was a real challenge. So it's not only the Bobbas and the, you know, it's not only women spreading this, it's definitely an equal opportunity offender thing. And maybe men and women have sympathies for different types of false information that they feel invested in personally. I think that might be interesting to study in future. But as one of the panelists said earlier, we'll only know in a year. We just don't know enough at this point about anything.
So Arthur, one of the big people, the victim of conspiracy here, George Soros's name comes up, in fact, much more often than Bill Gates does. Is George Soros just a word for Jew? Is it a conspiracy theory that always involves Jews when Soros's name is mentioned?
What George Soros and Bill Gates have in common is money. So very often, Soros is a synonym for Jews. Very often, it's a synonym for money, but in the same way that the Rothschilds were. So very often, the international Zionist bankers' conspiracy is a totally anti-Jewish conspiracy, but in the minds of many who believe in it, it's really about the wealthy who control the world. And I know the two are interchangeable, but that's the point about Soros as well. A lot of people don't realize that he's Jewish. They do realize, or they do know, that he has large amounts of money and that he dispenses it very liberally. And this seems to offend especially the far right when it comes to Jewish people who are wealthy and who disperse their funds so readily. But now we see the same happening with Bill Gates, for example. Bill Gates is the biggest philanthropist the world has ever seen.
When people make these allegations about Jewish conspiracy theorists, do you feel like they've never actually hung out with real Jews? Because if you put 5 Jews in a room and you try to get consensus on how to run the conspiracy theory, I mean, you'd have 12 opinions. It would never work.
Well, exactly. And that's also the argument against one of the most famous conspiracy theories ever, which is that the moon landing was faked. Now, if you look at the amount of people involved in it, also the amount of people that it takes to make a movie, if it really was a movie, there's no way you could have kept a lid on it. There's no way you wouldn't have vast amounts of evidence proving that it had been faked. And exactly the same thing with the supposed Jewish bankers conspiracy or Zionist bankers conspiracy. We all sitting here are thinking, where's my share if this is true?
Well, Howard Feldman, even on shows we've done together, there have been members of the Jewish community who talk about Soros.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that. I think that's quite interesting. Is I'm not, certainly from my listeners, I don't know that he is synonymous with somebody Jewish, because a lot of my listeners sit quite far to the right and obviously fight with a lot of stuff that we might talk about on the show, and they talk about Soros all the time, and he is just I don't even know, I think he's just a symbol of wealth on the left. That's how I would interpret it. I certainly don't see from my listeners' perspective that he's a symbol of somebody of synonymous with somebody Jewish.
So Nechama, you did post on the chat that we're meeting a little later this evening to decide how we're going to control the world.
Yes, yeah. Just checking. That's still on, right?
Yeah,
You haven't cancelled that. Yeah, okay.
It's the weather division that's meeting later.
Yes.
So we must make sure we do it on Zoom, because security there isn't so good. So in the last few moments that we have, because we do need to wrap up within the next few moments, the issue of masks seems to have become so politicized in the United States. And I'd love all of your opinions on how is it possible? Clearly a mask is in everyone's best interest, but when in the American society, the right wings see masks as almost a defeatist left-wing thing that the Democrats are trying to impose upon them and limit their freedom. How do we get to such a stage where someone can be that degree of self-destructive? Gus, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think Americans have a very different idea of what liberty means to what the rest of the world does. You know, there's no doubt. I mean, in the influenza epidemic of 1918 to 1920, the use of masks was seen as one of the main reasons why the epidemic was eventually able to be conquered. And in most societies in the world, certainly in societies like Japan and Korea and so on, it's not unusual to see people wearing masks in everyday life, never mind whether there's a pandemic on the go. But what's happened, and it's partly because of the Trump era, what's happened is that Americans have seen masks as symbols of a threat to their liberty, in the same way as they would see the Second Amendment, any attempt to challenge the Second Amendment as being a threat to their liberty. So it's become symbolic, and I think, you know, you see a number of images of the Statue of Liberty wearing a mask, and this kind of is seen very much as an attack. Never mind what the health benefits of wearing a mask are to some people, to a lot of people in America, from what we're seeing on YouTube and so on, to a lot of people, it's seen as a direct attack on their voice, direct attack on their freedom of choice. It is a very American thing. We're not really seeing it elsewhere in the world to that extent.
Arthur Goldstuck, are you the person who walks past people not wearing a mask and shouting at them on the street?
I don't shout at them, but I give them a dirty look. I'm actually learning from my younger daughter, Zianda, how to really give a dirty look. You must see the look that she gives when she sees people either not wearing a mask or they're wearing it below their noses. It could kill. It's probably more dangerous than the coronavirus. But on another very quick note, I think one of the things we're seeing is the influence of leadership in mask wearing. So in the United States, the president doesn't wear a mask because it makes him appear less manly, and his followers take their lead from him. In South Africa, our president is even willing to make a joke on himself in terms of learning how to put on a mask, and the country takes the lead from him. We are all, well, most of us, ready to put on masks.
So Nechama, a question that came up a little earlier was, give advice to people, 2 or 3 points. How do you identify fake news when you see it?
So first of all, use your reactions as a gauge. Okay, you should always pause before sharing anything. Just take that as gospel. Pause before sharing anything, even if it comes from the New York Times or the Guardian, because it could be 5 years old. So don't share without thinking, don't share without reading the original source. But then also see how you respond to the information that you're getting. Does it make you feel very, very angry? Does it make you feel very right, very self-righteous, very smug? If it makes you feel something in response, pause for a little bit longer, okay? Because that is always a sign that perhaps you are allowing your own feelings to guide it. Once you're doing that, you should then go and take that first step I mentioned, which is go and look at the source. And here we all need to learn to be a little bit more discriminating. There are a lot of classic fake news sites out there. And by classic fake news, I mean something that is news alike. So it's designed to look and feel and to resemble formal professional news, but it isn't. But in addition, what's often easy is even those WhatsApps that you get, if they tell you Dr. Arthur Goldstuck from the Miami Johns Hopkins Universities, if you go and Google that, in about 3 seconds, you'll find out that there is no university called that, and that there is no doctor called Arthur Goldstuck who works there. And in fact, Arthur Goldstuck is an urban legend specialist from South Africa. So simply by checking those kind of basic pieces of information that you get and doing that pause, doing that kind of emotional count to 10 around news, you should already identify a lot of false things. Don't share something just because it agrees very strongly with what you believe in. That's always a sign to pause for longer.
I want to share my screen and show you one of my favorite things that appeared on the news today. And you'll see in the riots taking place in the United States at the moment, someone was trying to use a Mazel Tov cocktail to burn up the police. Howard Feldman, the last word on this panel is in fact going to go to you, but I want to pose a question because I don't know if you know where the name the Spanish flu came from.
No, I don't.
In fact, the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 didn't start in Spain, nor was it worse in Spain. It was all over the United States and all over the United Kingdom, but the difference being that the British and American press were told to shut up about it by the powers that be, and they just didn't report on it at all. And the Spanish press reported on the flu and the epidemic that was taking place in Spain at the time, and that's why it became known as the Spanish flu. So in your final words, I'd love you just to talk about the responsibility of the press and the media to make sure that in fact we're reporting all the sides of the story and making sure that when we get things wrong, that we actually tell our readers and our listeners exactly what's right, what's wrong, and what they need to be careful of.
All right. So to end, I actually just want to, I think Nakama's point is correct, is that sometimes all sides isn't what we need to report. I think what we need to report is responsibly. And I like that notion of knowing that we're reporting. Sometimes we shouldn't be so quick to report on things that just make us feel good. I do think that we need to find an objective distance. We need to do that in every aspect of our lives. It's not just in reporting, it's in every relationship and every business discussion and everything that we're involved in. We need to find a way to, and we're on Zoom, but we need to zoom out. And I think we need to do that with reporting as well, and to be able to look at something objectively and say, what is our responsibility? I've said to you, Howard, a few times that I think that especially over COVID-19, that every single one of us have got a job. And this is something that we all globally need to fight together. We need to understand what our job is. I would suggest that most people on this panel, their job and our job is to try and bring balance and to try and bring rationality and cohesiveness to the way in which we present this whole notion of COVID. I think that we have a very, very important and powerful position. We're in a powerful position and we need to use it very, very responsibly.
So a question that I feel that we have to ask came in from Toby. Is Snopes good for fact-checking? Nakama, yes or no?
I love Snopes. I've met the founder of Snopes at one of our fact-checking conferences many years ago in Argentina, and he's a little bit kind of crazy, but the work they do is fantastic work. They tend to cover a slightly different spectrum, so we do see that the claims that get recirculated in South Africa are not always the same as the ones that they post about. But if there's something that you're reading about in the States, particularly with American government, American people, Snopes has often done it. And sometimes we find, Arthur, you'll like this, a lot of these things are urban legends, and they actually have covered them years before. So a couple of years ago, there were claims about child abductions that were being recirculated in South Africa. And they had a very striking similarity to a whole bunch of claims that Snopes had debunked years before. So I personally use Snopes. I send my children to use it. I think it's a great resource.
Arthur, are you a Snopes user?
Snopes, I met Snopes many years ago when he was still an urban legends legend. We hung out together in an online chat room called Alt Folklore Urban, and that's where he cut his teeth. His name's David Mickelson, And however, sweet guy when you catch him on his right side, but also crazy, as Nakama says.
Nakama, I see you posted on the chat, Africa Check actually has a check section for COVID.
Yeah, they have a section on their website, if you go to them now, where you can click on all of their COVID-related fact checks, because they do work for South Africa as well as Nigeria and Kenya. And all of their COVID fact checks are just gathered in one section on the site. And you can also send stuff to them if you encounter claims that you're not sure about. You can submit them to Africa Check for checking.
Well, I see so many people have asked whether, in fact, we can have this debate on whether black people can be racist, whether Jews can be racist on another occasion. I think we've opened up a can of worms that people actually want to discuss much further there, and would be certainly happy to do so. Howard, can you be racist?
Can I be racist?
The answer is no, it's not within your nature.
Well, I certainly can be, but I try not to be, is the answer.
I'd like to thank absolutely everyone for giving up their evenings this evening to appear on this panel. Arthur, thank you so much for putting all of this together. I want to give the final word to you, Arthur, before we put up the details again for Simon Sinek, who will be appearing on Thursday evening. So, Arthur?
My final word is that there's an urban legend going around that the coronavirus can be cured by single malt whiskey. Well, rest assured that if there's any truth in it, we'll find out. Yes, indeed. We're running clinical trials at the moment. I think Howard is part of those trials, and we'll let you know if it's true.
My understanding is that it's not a single dose. You have to take multiple doses over a long period of time.
Yes, it's of course, you've got to take your medicine nightly.
Fantastic. Thank you to all our panelists. A huge thank you to Dan Stillerman. Dan, thank you for keeping all the wheels going tonight. And you put on more clothing.
Forgot to unmute. Yeah, I got a little bit chilly here, but that was riveting. That was absolutely fascinating. So thanks to all the panelists. And yeah, really, really interesting stuff, useful resources. So brilliant panel. Thank you.
And fantastic polls we did as well. So Dan, you're going to put up the post and leave up for about 5 minutes the post of Simon Sinek. We'll see you all on Thursday evening. Have a fantastic week. Please stay safe and please stay sanitized. Thank you all. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.